Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start the event in about 30 seconds time. If you can all take your seats, please, before we begin. Thank you. Thank you. Mic is open.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session. I'm going to be your chair for this afternoon. My name is Pemi Gasela, and I am the Director for International Climate Change at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment in South Africa. And I'm also the national focal point for ACE. So I welcome you to this session that will be discussing and exploring the legal obligation of ACE. I think before we start talking about that, I think it's very important that I at least give a background of what ACE is so that we are all in the same page. Action for Climate Empowerment is a term adopted by the UNFCCC to denote work under Article 6 of the Convention and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. It calls on government to develop and implement educational and public awareness programs to foster access to information and promote public participation in addressing climate change and its effects. The overarching goal of ACE is to empower all the members of the society to engage in climate action through the 6 priority areas, that is education, training, public awareness, public participation, access to information, and international cooperations. Governments have the duty to involve citizens on climate change action. Today's session will explore the legal obligation to implement action for climate empowerment. Without further ado, let me introduce the panel to you. We have Francesca on my right hand side. I was still trying to think which one is the right. Francesca Migron, and then we have Deep Ray. And then we also have Shelley Bouger. I had to practice how to say their difficult names, French and Italian. So that was a bit of a training session for myself. Welcome. So maybe to kickstart the conversation so that we don't make it death by PowerPoint, maybe I'll start with Deep. Deep, maybe you can tell us why the report was commissioned in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Pemi. And thanks everyone for coming. Look, to be honest, the main point here when we were talking about ACE and trying to think about what the obligations were on governments and duty bearers, there wasn't necessarily an immediate element of clarity, right? We understand that Paris has legal obligations, but what legal obligations does the Glasgow Work Programme have, for example? There were question marks. And what the implications of those question marks are is that when you're trying to implement elements around action for climate empowerment, we don't know who to hold accountable. We don't know who to work with. And we also can't compel folks, governments, civil society, donors, philanthropies, to put money, resources, time, and expertise into delivering the elements of ACE. So the point behind this research piece that we commissioned our colleagues at DLA Piper to work with us on was to identify what specifically the legal obligations are around the 6 elements of ACE. And we had some very interesting findings. And for that, I'm going to hand it back.
Thank you very much, Deep. Shirley, maybe you can take us through the content of the report so that we understand what were the findings and, you know, take us deeper so that we understand more about this report. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, so we've been looking at AIDS from the perspective of international human rights law and also international environmental law. So in undertaking the legal analysis, we've been looking at the language of Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. And then we've been also looking at specific obligations that are prescribed by Article 12. And so our main findings, and you won't be surprised by the first one, is obviously, you know, by ratifying the Paris Agreement, states have agreed to act upon climate objectives and means to achieve those objectives. And that includes ACE. So states are therefore required to implement these obligations in good faith, according to the Vienna Convention, and give legal effect to these obligations at the national level. Then if you look at specific obligations, you have two sets of obligations. You have procedural obligations and one substantive obligation. In terms of the procedural obligations, ACE covers access to information and participation. And those obligations are actually really well established in international human rights law, and I'm going to develop that. The normative content, the substantive obligation relates to climate education, training, and empowerment, and is far less established, although we can make an argument that it is covered by the right to education. So in more details, if you look at the language of Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, it is phrased in mandatory terms. So it uses the word shall, and which is conventionally considered as creating rights and obligations for parties. So that seems to suggest an intention to impose a hard law obligations on states to enhance climate education, climate information, and participation. That being said, as you all know, the work plans are not legally binding and are voluntary, but states are still obligated to implement those obligations in good faith, right? So now the Article 12 does not set precise standards of behavior, and that could be used to assess compliance or non-compliance. The use of discretionary language, such as appropriate, opens the door for wide interpretation that can limit a consistent approach to implementation. Now, if you look at the specific obligations, so if you look at the procedural obligations, we're talking about access to information and participation. So access to information flows from the right to freedom of expression. The right to freedom of expression covers the right to seek, perceive, and impart information. UN bodies have recognized that climate information is covered by freedom of expression. If you look at specific international instruments, they are all covered, you know, they all cover the freedom of expression. We're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the African Charters on Human and People's Rights, and also the American Convention on Human Rights. Freedom of expression is widely established in international law. Climate information is widely covered. And now in terms of the content, what states are required to do. So states have an obligation to collect, update, and disseminate environmental information, environmental impacts on human health, and relevant laws and policies. They should also uphold requests to environmental information. Obviously, it's also covered in environmental law. So we have the Aarhus Convention, for example, which is exactly about access to climate information and public participation. Now, at the national level, many states have Freedom of Information Acts. And in fact, that particular obligations can be enforced in domestic courts. Now, participation. Participation is also a human rights obligation. This is about the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs, also covered in all the international instruments I have just mentioned. And so that includes the right to participate in development of policies, laws, regulations, projects, and activities, and occur at an early stage of the decision making. At the international level, so here at COP, meaning that everyone has a right to participate in the negotiation processes and voices should be heard. That's a human rights obligation. And at the national level, many states have also adopted laws for public participation in development of environmental impact assessment. So now climate education is a bit less established, although if you look at Article 13 of the ICCPR, to which 170 states are party to, you can make an argument that climate education is also covered. Principle 6 of the UN framework on human rights and the environment makes it clear that states should provide for education and public awareness on environmental matters. So few states have incorporated to date an obligation to incorporate climate education as part of national curriculums, but I hope that, more will be done in the coming years. So to conclude, ACE creates legal obligations on states to cooperate in relation to climate information, participation, and also climate education. But it goes back to the individual responsibility of states to implement these obligations at the national level. So if you look at participation, it means engaging prior to the negotiation with local communities and groups and various members of the societies, including the private sector, to ensure that the voices are heard during the negotiation processes.
Thank you very much, Shirley. I think that's very much appreciated, but maybe just a follow-up in terms of what you have tabled here with what the report is saying. Maybe just to ask how then, because the Paris Agreement, right, in its all totality, it's voluntary or it's in good faith, right? And as we know, we don't have the compliance mechanism that is very stringent. How then do we make sure that, countries implement action for climate empowerment? I mean, I heard you said the Article 12 talks about shall, but we can all say that sometimes the shall could encourage, but how do we go about making it that is obligatory indeed? Thank you.
So I think it goes back to the heart of international law, right? And the Vienna Convention is fairly clear that when you sign up to an international agreement, that you take a commitment as a state to implement these obligations. Then it depends on your own domestic legal system and the extent to which, in some jurisdictions, international law will have a higher status than national law. In other systems, you will have to enact a piece of legislation to give legal effect to the international norm. So then, when you have a political will to sign up to an international convention, that's your individual responsibility to take it back at home and say, okay, so according to my domestic norms, what is it I have to do to give legal effect to that particular norm? And then, yes, we know that the international climate change regime lacks an enforcement mechanism. That being said, we can look at other sources of international law, and that includes international human rights law to help bridge the accountability gaps. And that's what the UN bodies, the UN human rights bodies are doing, but also, regional courts or commissions and also domestic courts. So it goes back to, a case-by-case basis. But of course, implementation of human rights and ACE happens at the national level. But it also have to go back to the negotiation rooms to ensure that participation is facilitated. So that's not an easy question. And people have argued that, yes, the Paris Agreement is just a voluntary piece of paper and that does not is not binding on anyone. It is actually legally binding, but there's no enforcement mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and maybe over to you, Francesca. We recently had the text on Action for Climate Empowerment. In light of the negotiations, how does this report, relate to the negotiations? Maybe take us through that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pemi, and it's very nice to see you outside of the negotiation room where we spent a lot of time over the past week. The report comes at a very interesting time because just last Saturday, the subsidiary body for implementation concluded its action plan on Action for Climate Empowerment. So this is a document that spans over 4 years, and it outlines a series of action activities and deliverables that parties, but also the Secretariat needs to implement in the course of the next 4 years. And that really helps enhancing the implementation of the Paris Agreement in a way that respects public participation and human rights more in general. Looking at the negotiations, it was a lengthy process, and as co-facilitator, you know that well. It was particularly challenging for parties to understand the importance of reference human rights language in the text. Because of course, as we've seen, participation, access to information and education are pillars of ACE. So of course they were referenced as such. But for us, it was very important to frame them as human rights, because the human rights lens really puts everything in a more systematic way. If you talk about the right of public participation, of the right to access to information, it means that the state needs to put in place measures to create an enabling environment that structurally the policy making processes is made in a way that really the public can meaningfully engage. That, for instance, national determined contributions are drafted, implemented, and monitored in a way that the public and different constituencies can really take part in the process and put in place meaningful also suggestions to it. And having such an action plan is very important also with regard to compliance and accountability, which Shirley was just discussing. Because looking, for instance, at human rights treaty bodies, we've seen that they're in their reporting, in their periodic review of state parties, they mention more and more the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement. And so having an action plan is also a way for them in the future, hopefully, to look at it and suggest that parties take proactive steps to really implement it. And it's very interesting also, for instance, that Article 6 of the UNFCCC, so the one that establishes the basis for Action for Climate Empowerment, was, for instance, mentioned by the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their latest working group 2 reports that looks at adaptation and vulnerability. And they clearly say that Article 6 creates a binding commitment on parties to promote public participation in addressing climate change. And they add increased participation by civil society in climate policy discussion, including new forums such as the local communities and indigenous peoples platform of the UNFCCC work towards this goal. So we have both the kind of legal backing and the scientific community backing of the importance of ensuring public participation. And again, going back to human rights treaty bodies, they are more and more aware of the importance of public participation. We did a quick research about how many recommendations they issued over the past 10 years, mentioning participation in the context of climate action. In 2012, only one recommendation mentioned the need for the state to enhance participation. In 2022, which of course is not over yet, we already found 22 recommendations that did encourage the state to put in place better measures to enhance participation at the national level when putting in place mitigation or adaptation action. So I think that in a context of accountability and increased compliance, these international treaty bodies, together also with, for instance, national human rights institutions, local actors, can really play an important role in making sure that climate action is more and more rights-based. And Shirley did a great presentation about the obligations that states have to put in place participatory processes nationally. But it's also interesting to look at the Aarhus Convention and the Escazú Agreement that establish obligations on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in the context of environmental policies. And it's interesting because both instruments establish obligations for parties to enhance these procedural rights and obligations in international fora. So the parties that are parties to the Aarhus Convention, to Escazú Agreement, actually have an obligation to ensure that the climate talks, that talks in the context of biodiversity, UN, EA, and so on, happen in a way that really enhance public participation, which is something that we haven't seen so often. And actually the negotiations on ACE provide a very interesting example, because as you recall, Pemi, last year, parties had issues, let's put it this way, allowing observers in all the sessions that they had. And that eventually led to a work program that was adopted last year that is very weak in the language. It doesn't mention any human rights, which is really unacceptable since we're talking about participation, education, and public participation. But on the contrary, this year, since civil society really made a fuss about the process, the negotiations were extremely open. From day one, we were part of the table. We were even allowed into the INF sessions that often are close to observers. And so that really allowed for a very fruitful exchange between observers and parties, and ensured that finally human rights language was reflected both in the preamble and in the actual operative part in the action plan. So all of this to really say that participation is helpful on a substantive level, but also on a process level. Going back to the action plan, it will be interesting from now on to see what the Secretariat will write about it, because the deliverable that is part of the action plan mandates the Secretariat to identify best practices in the implementation of the ACE elements at the national level, with specific reference to human rights. And so the Secretariat will have to capture this dimension in their annual report to the COP. So that's very promising, and it's also a way to keep track of what's going on at the national level. At the same time, it will help constituted bodies within the convention to better dialogue among themselves and report on action for climate empowerment, because one of the activities about exactly so making sure that constituted bodies can dialogue with each other, can report on ACE elements in their own activities. So hopefully this action plan will promote a more participatory action, both at the national level, but also here in the context of the UNFCCC, with positive results across different work streams. Public participation is essential, not just in the context of ACE, but if we look, for instance, at Article 6, all the question of carbon markets, we need to ensure that the mechanisms that will generate credits are implemented in a way that does not harm the rights of the communities involved, that the rights of free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people is respected, that there are redress mechanisms in case violations occur when these projects take place. So the participatory element is key. If we look at loss and damage, I hear that the text on the Santiago network has just been concluded. I haven't seen the text, but I hear that, for instance, the advisory body will have to have representatives from the women and gender constituency, young indigenous people. So very much the participatory element is there, and is also, again, a result of having indigenous peoples organizations, civil society organizations being at the table and keeping pushing for these elements to be included. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Francesca.
Actually, I wonder if I can jump in here. I'd like to ask you, Pemi, in terms of the participation, and yes, we've talked about it at this international level, how does ACE actually work out in your own national implementation context? You take the hat off as co-facilitator, you get back to Joburg, you walk into the office. How does ACE then become a part of your day-to-day work? What is it that South Africa is doing? What is it that you are leading? I think it's important for us to contextualize the real world applications, and we have you here, and I don't want to miss that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jeep. I thought you called me to chair. Now I'm being put in a hot spot. But thank you. Maybe just to respond to your question. In South Africa, I think we take this thing of public awareness, public participation very seriously. And one of the things that we have done is firstly have an ACE focal point, because then that person will coordinate all ACE related issues and will make sure that there's public awareness, there's public participation, and also education and training. And that person is sitting here talking to you. So so that's what, that's the first thing we've done. And we've also included the youth, as Francesca was saying, that the youth, civil society, academia are very important in this participation. So in South Africa, we've also done that. We include the youth, as we know that they are the future. And as they always say, nothing without us, nothing for us without us. So we also make sure that that is implemented. And most of the civil society, they have the training, the capacity. So we also work with them to ensure that at least they help us in terms of how we deal with action, with climate actions. And when we go to negotiations, for an example, when we come here, one of the things that we do, we have what we call a stakeholder consultations, and talk about what is it that we're taking to COPs. And when we come back, we also report back in terms of what has happened and what has taken place. And I think what can be improved with that is we could also improve it by making sure that it is translated in different languages, because as you know that South Africa, we have 12 languages, right? It will be important for everyone to be included, and also the mode of communication, how we go about communicating, would also need to be improved in terms of how we do that. So those are the things that we still need to improve, but I think we're doing well and we're almost there. Thank you. I think we have come to the end of the formalities and would like to open the floor for participants to ask questions to our panelists. And this is now your time. Speak now, or as they say in court, forever hold your peace. Don't be shy. We can take any question. We'll try and answer.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's really great. I just want to find out, so we obviously looked at the international side when we're talking about access to information, but what actions are being taken from a South African perspective, or have we looked at the legal obligations in South Africa when we talk about access to information, FPEC, consultation, because obviously the Constitution provides a platform for that. So do we need to be looking at all these international agreements when we already have a very well-established consultation process in South Africa? And is that something that we're going to be looking at in the future? Thanks.
Hi, Joel Silver from the National Trust in the UK. My question is, great presentations, by the way, thank you. How can NGOs, civil society and non-state actors help with the implementation and advancement of ACE as a theme?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give it a first go, and then my colleagues can answer, especially on the second question, right? The first question I think was really directed to me. Now, in terms of how the civil society can be involved, I think, as I said when I started, is that most of the capacity is within the civil society. And the important part is that for the civil society to also come to national governments and say, this is what we can provide, and this is what we are able to do, so that they work together. I mean, we need a collaborative effort, and I think that's how we can be able to deal with climate actions. And in terms of the legalities in the national context, I think one of the things that we do, especially as you know, that South Africa has also ratified the Paris Agreement. So we're trying really to make our own climate action, the climate bill, which is still going to be come into force. So that will also be reflecting how action for climate empowerment, public participation is dealt with in terms of that. And then we also have the National Climate Change Response Policy that deals with climate change. That also talks about capacity building, public participation, public awareness. That is also reflected in our national communications. That is also reflected. But I think the climate change bill is what really is going to force the obligatory nature of action for climate empowerment. Thank you.
I'll have a stab at that second question to start with. I think one of the key things to remember here is our ACE national focal point from South Africa is a bit of an anomaly, in the sense that ACE is actually a very low priority across all countries, right? If you go to the UNFCCC website for named ACE national focal points, I believe there's 132 named focal points, of which maybe 40 attended the negotiations this time around. So we're missing a huge swathe of people physically just being in the room and negotiating on behalf of their countries. So that's one problem. But it also feels like it's low on the priority because it's seen as somewhat of a novelty, somewhat of a, oh, it'll be nice to do a bit of ACE at the end. But actually, that's where NGOs and civil society flip that narrative on its head. All of our experience at Climate Outreach shows that actually bringing people on board is what creates a political mandate for governments to then come here with different policies. And I'll give you a real example of a real-time example of this. We did a project with a number of partners surveying the attitudes and kind of beliefs of young people across Europe in 6 countries. And we found that something like 60% of all of those surveyed were of the opinion that there needed to be reparations by European governments on loss and damage. So if young people are starting to have these kinds of ideas, they're discussing amongst themselves, they're feeling the impacts of climate change in their backyard, eventually it stands to reason that they will go to the ballot box with some of these ideas. And that then starts to change politics, right? And I think that's the key point here. The more informed the public is, the better and stronger the mandate for governments to act on climate change. Right now, that pressure isn't there. They don't feel the pressure as much as some of the other lobbies that a government has to deal with. And so that is where that change will start to happen with participation. And so coming back to the point, civil society has a real critical role to play because they play that bridging role. Climate Outreach, for example, works with a number of communicators around the UK. And we work with communities and people to understand what their values are based on and how they link their values to perceptions of climate change, to their natural environment. And that then enables people to feel more empowered to start making some of those decisions. We know for a fact in the UK, in the latest Office of National Statistics research that has come out, that more than 70% of the UK population has a high concern about climate change. What's the missing link? They don't know necessarily how to do something about it. And that's where the governments of the world have an opportunity. If they begin and start more public engagement processes, more public participation processes, people will be able to feed in some of that, that kind of perspective. And not only that, they'll be able to own part of the policy that comes out, right? And because we've seen what happens when it comes top down. We've seen what happens when policies come top down. The Gilets Jaunes example in France is a fantastic example where the policy of adding additional duties to fuel is a really good and sensible policy to try and start to tackle climate change. But without that public participation, without that public engagement conversation about how people feel about that, it was rejected. So there are real clear evidence pieces in the world today that show us the need for public engagement. And that's where civil society and that's where NGOs can really step into the void and start to make some of those changes start to reflect in the political process.
Yeah. Can you, yeah. So I would say, yeah, I totally agree with all you said. I would add, you know, all members of the society, including also, you know, global law firms with, you know, pro bono practices and also private actors. I think, you know, if we're talking about inclusiveness, I think everybody should be part of the process as well in a constructive way to make sure that ACE is implemented. And I think it's civil society and all other actors as well. Yeah.
Maybe just to complement quickly, I think Deep, you mentioned, you said a word bridging that is very important. And this bridging exercise that civil society organizations can really do at different level. At the national level, civil society organizations are those that are most connected to the ground. So of course, if a government wants to reach out to the population, often in organization like civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, know which stakeholders to reach out to really make sure that all different constituencies, children, youth, women and girls, disability community, and so on, are really reflected in the process. But also bridging across ministries. Often we hear that many ministries act in silos. It's education ministry that should deal with ACE. Is it the foreign affairs ministry? Is it the environmental ministry? So often having an external civil society organization coming and trying to connect different actors within the institutions is also a role that we can play. And then bridging at the international level, the institutions that we've done a lot of work, for instance, ensuring that the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Treaty bodies speak to the UNFCCC and they incorporate the climate dimension in their work, and vice versa, of course, integrating the human rights dimension here. But often they don't speak to each other because, again, often the negotiators come from different ministries, different delegations, and so they are not even aware of the positions of their own country vis-a-vis climate change, but from different perspectives. So often an exercise that we do is that we brief states about their obligations that they have from a human rights perspective when we are here in the climate change sphere, and vice versa. We remind them of the steps that their own delegations took in the climate sphere when we interact with their delegation within human rights institutions. So it's this content bridging and really connecting the dots exercise that I think it's very important.
Thank you very much. I think we can take the last round of questions if there are any. No questions?
I'm Zakaria Mohammed Awal, a lawyer from Nigeria. This is my first time attending anything about climate change, but I take interest in what this gentleman say, loss and damage. Please, a bit explanation on it.
I think let's take another question. Teddy, you have a question? You shy? Okay. All right. Deep, do you want to take it?
Well, my response is going to be very short. I'm going to hand over to Francesca.
Thank you, Deep. So I don't follow personally loss and damage, and that's a whole new bucket of work. But this is a concept that has been emerging over the past almost 10 years. And the idea is that even if parties adapt to climate change impacts, even if they mitigate, so they reduce emissions, there will be still some losses and damages that are suffered. It's loss of land, it's change in weather patterns, and so loss of agriculture crops, the need to diversify the economy. It's displacement of populations because some areas are no longer livable. And so there are all these questions on non-economic losses, so the loss of culture, for instance, or traditional livelihood. And so the key question that underlines the concept of loss and damage is how we compensate and we address these losses and damages that cannot be recovered. And of course, that goes towards finance. So now countries are very much discussing about whether further finance beyond the mitigation and adaptation one should be allocated specifically to loss and damage. But it's also a question of technical assistance, because there are some losses like loss of culture, traditional livelihoods, and so on, that cannot really be quantified, but countries should have the support in addressing them and supporting their own population. And so that's why parties are, for instance, negotiating the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. So how to increase capacity building, share of expertise and information. And that's very interesting because the human rights lens and participation aspect came very much into play in the conversation on the Santiago Network, because when you establish a structure that should support state in addressing loss and damage, you really need to ensure that the whole structure can help parties implement actions that are human rights based, that really respect population, promote participation, transparency, and so on. And so I think that everything that we'd said in the context of ACE is very relevant in the context of loss and damage.
Thank you very much. I see a hand.
I have a very specific question on what can civil society organizations do to push more implementation of ACE in their respective countries? And I hope that's not a hard question. I hope it's a question we can explore the answer for.
Thanks for that. Well, there are definitely a number of ways in which we can approach that in terms of specifics. So firstly, if we look at the 6 elements of ACE, then we can call on governments to live up to their legal obligations. So live up to your legal obligations on allowing public space, allowing civic space for people to participate in political processes. It's also incumbent on duty bearers, in this case, governments, to make sure that the right information is shared to vulnerable and every other part of the population, because information is power. Information allows you to make decisions that could protect your lives and livelihoods from the onslaughts of climate change. So that's another really specific thing. Make sure that information, and Pemi brought that up earlier about simple things that we may not necessarily think about, like translation, making sure that the science is translated and accessible and made accessible to all parts of the population, because it is difficult. I mean, even for most of us who are educated, some of the science is baffling. I don't know about you, but I've taken one look at the full IPCC report and literally not had any idea what to do with it. So it's important to make some of that information accessible. Civil society can play both a bridging role in that, in making it more accessible, but also working with governments to make sure that the right communities have access to that information. And then in terms of the other elements of ACE around public access to information and public awareness, those are all kind of second layer. Once you've done the participation, once you've made sure the information is out there, there stands to reason that people's awareness grows alongside. The elements of training, that's definitely something that we focused on during the ACE negotiations, about strengthening the ability of incredible ACE national focal points such as PEMI, so that they can then go into their communities, into their national contexts, and start the process of bringing people along this journey that we all need to make. But that training then comes back at a kind of a local and community level as well, where ensuring participatory methodologies are put in place so that everyone can have a say in how some of these decisions are made and how they've gotten to. There are so many models out there right now. Climate Assembly's model, which is making its way through Europe and North America, where people are brought together, given the interface with the scientists and the climate experts to get a better sense of what happens, and then together shaping outcomes that are then shared with politicians at the local and national level. So there are lots of different ways of doing it. But at the end of the day, the role that NGOs and civil society can play in their different national contexts is to keep it on the agenda, is to make sure it isn't just some fringe thing that might happen, but the focus is on this, the real work, the important work. It is very real. It is the key that will unlock our ability as society, as a community of nations, to actually make that meaningful step. Because unless everybody's involved, this isn't going to happen. And we've seen that time and time again.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to now the end of our session. Deep, maybe you want to say a few words to close?
I will do. Thank you, Pemi. I just wanted to thank Shirley, who has done an extraordinary amount of work on our report, and our partners, such as Francesca and a whole group of colleagues around the ACE community who provided input into the report. I'd urge you all to go to Climate Outreach's website to download it. It's at www.climateoutreach.org. Please feel free to download the report. We're here. If you have any questions, please come and find us. And of course, a big round of applause to our most incredible Pemi for having done a brilliant job of delivering us an ACE action plan, and for expertly steering us through today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. The session is now adjourned. Thank you.